The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special edition Corporate Vision's customers only webinar, Designing Memorable Neuroscience-Backed Presentations, what the recent MEMSI acquisition means for you, our Corporate Vision's customers. My name is Steve Jones, Vice President of Marketing here at Corporate Visions, and I'll be moderating today's event. But before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items so we can make today's event as interactive as we can for everybody here in attendance. You've joined the presentation using your computer speakers by default, but if you prefer to join by phone, just go ahead and select telephone in the audio pane, and the dial-in information will be displayed. You'll also have the opportunity to submit questions to our presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane on the control panel. You can feel free to send in your questions at any time during the event. We'll collect those and answer them really throughout the entirety of the event. Also, as a reminder, following the webinar, we'll be sending all attendees a recording of today's webinar along with the actual slides within the next 24 hours or so. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. First, our very special guest, who is sure to become a regular on our webinars moving forward, Carmen Simon, the new Chief Science Officer here at Corporate Visions and founder of MEMSI. And Tim Reister, Chief Strategy Officer at Corporate Visions, co-author of the 3 Value Conversations, and co-author of the upcoming book, The Expansion Sale. Tim, I believe you're going to kick things off for us today, so I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Steve. I don't want to take up too much time today because everybody's here to hear Dr. Carmen Simon, but I'm talking to my favorite audience today, Corporate Visions customers. You guys are the believers in the science-backed approach to customer messaging, customer conversations. And what's really interesting here, 2 things I have to say, and then turn it over to Carmen for the rest of the way, is that Corporate Visions, as you all know, as our customers, has been the whiteboarding company. There's just no denying that. And you may have even heard us poo-poo PowerPoint in the past. And what I would say is we only poo-poo poopy PowerPoint, not good PowerPoint. And so Corporate Visions recognizes the voice of business is majority PowerPoint, especially as you get into more remote environments like this one right here. And so the idea is that we wanted to find science-backed presentation and content and PowerPoint presentation types of ideas and concepts, and that's what we found in MEMSI and Dr. Carmen Simon. So we are excited to bring that to you today as now a part of the Corporate Visions family. And we wanted to do a webcast dedicated to you as our favorite customers first. The other thing I would say is if you were at our client summit, our client success summit, you heard Carmen, and I'm much chagrined by the fact that she was the highest rated speaker. You can imagine my ego took a bruising, but you're going to see why in a moment if you weren't at that event, why this content is so interesting and so outstanding. So without further ado, I am going to turn this over to our guest speaker, our new Chief Science Officer, cognitive neuroscientist, Dr. Carmen Simon. Carmen, welcome and take it away.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you, Steve, for our introductions. It's exciting to look at communication from the angle of how the brain works, because everybody in your audience has a brain. If you attended the summit a few months back, you may remember that the basic reason why we have a brain is so we can move, physically move. And what we know from neuroscience is that the brain moves based on what it remembers. So from that angle, the moment that you create a memory in somebody else's mind, you increase your ability to convince them to move in your favor. So for today's session and from here on out, as they will partner with us, I'm hoping that we all make memory our mission, because one of the main reasons why we participate in events like this is because at some point we would like to convince people to move towards our cause, and we create memory traces in other people's brains. We increase the chances of doing so. Of course, easier said than done, because memory is so fallible. People forget a lot after being exposed to even brilliant business content. Imagine when that content doesn't achieve its mark, then it's even worse. But we know that on average, after about 48 hours, people forget 90%, sometimes even more. And who is to blame them really? Because we are not that different from our customers. In fact, I'd love to know what makes you forget, because we are all humans. We haven't merged with robots just yet. I'd love for you to use the questions function here in the GoToMeeting platform and type in a few of your reactions. Why is it that you forget? Steve and Tim and I are monitoring your reactions, and I'm seeing some patterns already in your responses. A few of you are talking about distractions and multitasking. Of course, age has to do with it. So, Jeff, don't feel bad, because memories are not guaranteed that they will live in our brains forever, and they do decay, especially as we get older. Some irrelevant information, of course, becomes forgettable. And all of you are correct in your statements, and you will see how your remarks here in the questions box match the literature that we see related to memory. You will see some variables here listed on the screen that you as a communicator can control for other people. You'll also see some variables that you cannot control. For example, I can't control the emotional state that you're in right now. I cannot control the amount of drugs that you may have taken. Obviously not for this call, but just in general. I cannot control the amount of sleep that you got last night. Out of curiosity, use the same questions box and share with us how many hours of sleep did you get last night. I'm curious to see where most of the audience members reside when it comes to sleeping. And if we were to take an average of the answers that I'm seeing here in the box, you would match what the statistics is, at least for North America. 60% of people get about 6 hours or less of sleep per night. And that's too bad where memory is concerned, because you see, your memories are not formed instantly. They need consolidation time, and sleep helps with that consolidation. Luckily, though, when it comes to building memorable content, which is the premise of the session, because when you do, you increase your persuasive power, there are many more variables that you can control. And those are the kinds that we're here to talk about, especially given this premise that matched some of your answers here in the chat box when you said, why is it that you forget? Quite a few of you mentioned the amount of information that we're exposed to. There is no shortage of information these days. And of course, it's not surprising that people forget that much. We want to solve for you this combination of problems that we're seeing in the business content world. We're noticing that content is very quickly forgettable, and we're also noticing that customers are exposed to messages that are quite often alike. There's not enough differentiations, which where memory is concerned, that means that there's interference. You won't remember after a while who said what. So it's no wonder that some people have this reaction that you see here on the screen. We want to fix that through 4 ways. Due to the merger between Menzie and Corporate Visions, we now can add to the inventory of resources and skills that we can provide to you. So let's go through all these 4, and also in the process of sharing these capabilities that we have for all of you, our favorite customers, you'll also learn some practical things that you can apply as early as this afternoon. Neuroscience research is one of the capabilities that we're adding, a deeper focus on using especially EEG technology as we investigate the brain's reaction to business content. Primarily, our function is to use EEG technology, as you see here on the screen, and record what happens in the brain when it gets stimulated. And as many of you may know, and some of you may still remember from the keynote a few months back, when the brain is faced with stimulation, it generates various brain waves that differ in terms of amplitude and frequencies. We can record these with electrodes that we place on people's scalps, and when we do, we can connect them with different cognitive processes that are happening in the brain. For example, when we place these electrodes on people's scalps, we can measure things related to the variables that you're seeing here on the screen. And all of these can give us some indication as to, are people likely to remember what you're saying, and are they likely to react in your favor? That's the biggest variable of all, really. If you look here, motivation is one of the variables that we are very excited about, because If we notice what people remember and their inclination to lean into your message, then you're more likely to expect action from them. Once we create these studies, we make sure that they happen in realistic settings. You can see here some pictures from some studies that we have conducted in the past. Some of the devices that we use are a little bit more intense. Some of them are a bit more benign, as you can see here, in terms of the amount of electrodes. We also use an ECG cable. That's an electrocardiogram signal that we get. This is how we can reach variables that are related to affective neuroscience. We use the eye tracking devices as well, and you can see here briefly a recent study that we did where we can tell very quickly that it's unlikely that people will remember things here from the left-hand side because people are not even looking there. And once we make these recordings, we put them through various statistical analysis software, and this is where we can create some brain scans, and those inform us in terms of where do the brain waves that I just shared occur in the brain, in what brain parts, with what intensity, and with what synchronicity. And all of those we can then link to some insights that we can make about how the brain is processing your content. We've been very particular lately, and this matches so well the message that you have been hearing from Corporate Visions, related to emotions, because as you know, primarily we are emotionally driven beings. We like to believe that we are rational, but sometimes we're not so much so. So therefore, the focus on affective neuroscience has to be primary. Not that many people are doing this, so we're excited to bring this set of emotions that you see here on the screen. And in the next screen, you'll see how if we consider the circumplex, which is the intersection of the brain being highly alert, this is high arousal, versus not, this is low arousal, versus valence, which means how much does the brain even enjoy the experience. It can be positive or negative. Notice how at the intersection of these, we can be very particular and precise about affective neuroscience, which is so important in motivation and an approach behavior towards your cause. For example, as you're creating things, you don't really want people to get bored. And while you might want them to get a little bit annoyed or angry initially, because perhaps there's a problem that your solutions are promising to solve, you don't want them to stay there for too long. So keep this circumplex in mind, and now you can see how we can place it on top of stimulation that we're covering or evaluating. So for example, here we are helping a client evaluate an app that they had just developed. You can see the eye tracking, so we know where the person is looking. And notice in the upper left corner how that yellow dot, that's the representation of this person's brain, is moving around those emotions. So right now, if I were to pause my screen, notice how I know the person is bored. I know that attention-wise, he's not paying too much attention. Working memory-wise, which means carrying some elements from one segment to another, that's quite involved, which means the person is perhaps expending some extra cognitive energy, which maybe they don't necessarily need to because the app is supposed to be intuitive. So you see, it's these kinds of research projects and the capabilities that we can bring to your content so we can answer early on, even at the prototype level, which this one was, by the way, what are some things that are working, what are some things that are not, and we can rescue you from unnecessary expenses, because if you catch things early on, then you don't have to spend a whole lot of time figuring things out. And I promised practical guidelines related to the neuroscience research. So here's one. As we do our research studies and people are wearing the devices, we ask them to take a baseline. And you can see here the blue color indicates to me that attention-wise, which is here measured on a scale 0 to 100, it's fairly low. And this is because I asked them during the baseline to just simply stare at a beige wall, for instance, in front of them, somewhere where there's nothing going on stimulation-wise. Then they do, and then we're ready to start the study. In this case, it was them watching a corporate video for salespeople. And across that video, we set some triggers, and we want to know what happens in the brain at specific moments, as you can see the verticals here. And I'm mentioning this because as we were looking at the results, when we were investigating those videos, we could see that there was no statistical significance between this baseline and these segments that people wanted to make memorable. So the finding here for the client was that the stimulus is not strong enough and it's comparable to the brain looking at a beige wall. So clearly something else needs to be done differently, as we were saying here in the practical guidelines, make sure that things are stimulating either visually or cognitively, preferably both, in order for the stimulus to be strong enough and compete with the beige wall. Here's the real practical guideline that I want you to get from this neuroscience research piece. We're also noticing in this particular study that every single segment in the video you're investigating was correlated to the next segment and the next segment yet and this next segment yet. This is huge because it has to do with this notion of priming the brain for a decision, meaning that all of your components in a communication sequence are linked. There is no such thing as an independent segment. There is no such thing as, oh, well, let's just ease off here for a bit because we've worked hard enough. Every single segment in a sequence can prime the brain for what happens next. I'm such a big believer in this that one of my recent keynotes even was around this notion of priming the brain for a decision. I was starting that presentation by saying, as I had just shared with you, that memory influences all the decisions that the brain makes. And in order to understand priming, you have to understand a little bit more of how memory works. Well, if we think about how memory works, how does it work? We take in the world through our senses. That information is lost very quickly. Some information will still make it into our short-term memory or working memory. If we're really good at practicing it, then we can earn long-term memory, but the story doesn't even stop there. When it comes to your long-term memories, there are some memories that you can put into words, such as perhaps a story that happened to you, an event that happened to you when you were spending your honeymoon in Paris. And knowing that Paris is the capital of France, that too is a memory that you could put into words. That's a factual type of memory. And notice how some memories you can't really put into words, such as the fact that you learn how to ride your bike, and if you had to explain to someone how you ride your bike, you could probably fall off the bike. There are some other things that are implicit memories, and meaning that you can't really put them into words. And the good news for all of us, by the way, is that all of these memory systems reside in different parts of the brain, which is why even people with Alzheimer's can still build some memories because some parts are not affected by that terrible disease. And I'm mentioning this because if we know the concept of priming is a type of implicit memory, which means that every single segment within your sequence of segments can prime the brain for what happens next. Every stimulus has the potential to influence how the next stimulus is being understood and processed. So one of the practical guidelines that I want you to take away from this neuroscience piece is, as you reflect on your communication right now, look at the sequence and look at each component in that sequence. This is why you must, from here on out, be very, very particular about how you even start a sequence, because the start can then prime the brain for the next segment. And then if you want to rescue the middle, sometimes for memory, middles in the sequence get a little blurry. Wonder, how can I make each segment to its absolute power so that I can influence the next segment yet? Tim, as you know, the customers who are joining the call, do you have any reactions or comments for this point before I move on, this notion of priming the brain for what happens next?
Well, yeah, I want everybody to sort of think of the picture with the folks with the EEG hats or bands on, and think about this. We have a client, to be not named, but who's got a brand new CEO, a brand new chief marketing officer, and a brand new customer success officer. And they are launching a very bold new vision for the company. It's a pivot in the company, and they want to make a big splash at their sales kickoff with a very important high-level speech. And they're going to be allowing us to measure the reactions of their audience this way. So this is sort of the debut for that speech. And they certainly want it to be a home run there, but it's really the stump speech for them moving forward with the entire company for the next year or so. So hopefully then being able to learn what they learn about what landed and what was most impactful and maybe where they could improve some things. But I just want you as our audience to think about the investment that's made sometimes in very important messaging moments and how valuable would it be to know how it's landing, how it's being received, and whether all of the intentions you had going in are actually being executed. So we're kind of excited about this as a service opportunity to take more of the guesswork out of these things. And I think it's very brave of this organization who's working with us to take their big, bold, new executive level speech and let us test it, because that means that the presenter as well as the presentation are being judged. So it should be interesting, Carmen.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting, and knowing that from the brain's perspective, the only thing that matters is what happens next. So as you reflect on your own communication sequences, just know that every segment will influence and will play a big role into what happens next. One other segment that MEMSI is bringing to corporate vision is this section where I, as a scientist and as a person with a healthy addiction to how the brain works, will bring to the table is a few keynote engagements. Those typically happen either during conferences or webinars, very much like this, or various corporate events. I know that the corporate event season is in full bloom right now, November, December, January. On the screen, I'm displaying some examples of keynotes that have been popular. Some with a more serious, some with more of a lighthearted title, as you can see here. I will share with you a practical guideline that is quite popular in some of the keynotes that I'm presenting. This, by the way, has become a popular one as the world is becoming more algorithm driven, and some clients have been asking us to reflect on that. But one message that permeates throughout the keynotes that I deliver and that you will benefit from being on this call is to have the humility that the brain forgets so much. And we're not so worried about the 90% plus that people forget. What we're concerned about is with this notion of, are you in charge of what you want people to remember? Are you controlling your 10%? Like as you're looking here at my screen, there's an example of a presentation that we received initially where even though it was short, only 9 slides, people are still missing the essence of what they wanted to make sure that others remember. They were missing their 10%. When we were redoing the slides, notice how now there's a clear 10% message that is differentiated and repeated throughout that sequence. Also notice that as people are presenting remotely a lot more frequently, now you have more slides, not fewer slides, because we recognize that the modern brain needs extra stimulation in order to stay focused. So having the clarity of a message and repeating it enough puts you in a position to control your 10%. I'm sure that many of you on the call here are familiar with the famous adage, tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them, and tell them what you told them. That's known as the T3 principle. That principle is in dire need of being rescued with neuroscientific research, because if you're only repeating a message twice, you're essentially announcing what you're going to talk about and come back to it at the end. That is not sufficient to put you in charge of a memory that you want to create in other people's brains. And we agreed in the beginning that unless you put a memory in other people's brains, you're not as likely to persuade them to act in your favor. Now, when it comes to the clarity of that 10%, I also want to bring a deeper layer into our conversation, because if you're looking at your memories are really a database of self, which is why we were talking about Alzheimer's earlier. One of the reasons why it's such a debilitating disease is because you essentially lose yourself. And if you're thinking about your database containing various goals that you have and you remember, various beliefs that you may remember consciously or subconsciously, some self-images, then memory is always at this tension of you keeping a close track of things that happened accurately versus a memory that is constantly indulging an ever-evolving self. And what I mean by this, sometimes you remember what you want to remember because that serves you better. It doesn't mean that you're remembering accurately. You just remember to make yourself feel better. If you were to remember every single thing with 100% accuracy, all of you would be 100% depressed every single moment of the day. So we're always at this tension of keeping close track, because if you're not remembering some things with accuracy, you will not know where to move next. Therefore, you'll not know physically how to survive well. But at some point, you are being served by some of the things that are constantly changing. So I'd love for you to adopt this phrase that's called adaptive coherence, meaning that, yeah, you may remember some things accurately, but at some point, you're constantly shifting things and acting based on what serves you well. So, for example, if you recognize that you received some really nice kisses out of a loved one, the moment that you give them flowers but not chocolate, guess what you will keep giving them, because you tend to act on what serves you well, and you tend to remember what is rewarding. Memory is highly motivated. So if we think about it in this way, then let's bring that down to business, because when you talk to your own customers, you have the opportunity to tell them something and they will remember it accurately. And that is called verbatim memory. Therefore, they will remember word for word what you just expressed, versus satisfying something that is constantly changing. So therefore, your customers may remember kind of the general meaning of what you're sharing with them. Where in this spectrum does your messaging lie? Because when you're reflecting on how much people remember, let's just say we take some famous novels that you may have read in high school or in college. If you're really to reflect on these novels that you see displayed here on the screen, how much verbatim do you really remember from these? I would probably say, in fact, if you want to type in the chat box, I'm monitoring those well. And I know Adam is asking if you're being fine right now, and the answer is totally yes. We have to practice what we preach. But if you want to reflect on this clarity of your 10% message, then you have to ask the question, do I kind of sort of want my customers to remember what I'm saying? Or do I want them to remember what I'm saying with precision? Like, for instance, even from our conversation right here, I would hope that you remember verbatim this message, control your 10%, and the rest perhaps is gist. So the next time that you want to create a memory in somebody else's brain, ask the question, if I had the courage to ask them 48 hours later what they remember, would you accept as a correct answer simply just verbatim? Would you be that strict with yourself? Would you accept a combination of verbatim and gist when you were reflecting on their answers? Or would you accept only gist? And there's no right or wrong answer, by the way, in these. You are in charge of the percentage of gist versus verbatim. But just know that if people remember gist from you, and your competition is also presenting on similar topics, and they also remember gist from them and gist from somebody else, then you're definitely in danger, because some differentiation is needed, and that differentiation quite often comes from verbatim. Of course, to get to verbatim, you have to have a lot of repetition. Sometimes I have to smile and smile not in a funny way, by the way, in kind of a sad way, because doctors and patients and pharmacists are in this danger of being victims of gist. Notice how many pills are being mistaken for other pills. And of course, especially for this last one that I'm displaying here, you might be in trouble if you take one versus another. Pharmacists are struggling with this as well. So as you're reflecting on your messages, when you clarify your 10%, make sure that there is enough repetition and enough distinctiveness, and you aspire at enough verbatim, just to make sure that you're not essentially delivering other people's messages. And that is one key message that will permeate my speeches, and one lesson that I'm hoping you'll take out of this call with us. And Tim, I'll turn it over to you briefly, because you know how to associate this with what our customers on the call want.
Yeah, thanks, Carmen. So I think there's a couple of things that you said there. We talk to our customers often about the hammock effect, and how people will basically be in a position to not be able to remember, recall most of what you say. And the idea of 90% is forgotten, control your 10%. I love that idea, because I think people think that they love, if people forget 90%, their goal is, maybe if I get them to forget only 80% and remember 20%, like the goal is getting them to remember more. But you're saying what really happens is they almost can't remember more. So you just need to make sure that that memory is controlled. not random, because the point is they remember 10%, make sure it's the 10% you want them to remember, right?
Exactly. So be very deliberate and in charge of that and not leave memory to chance. And while it is physically possible for the brain to remember more, you don't really want them to, because if you enable people to remember more, that means they have to expand more cognitive energy recollecting those memories. And every single time that you activate a memory, you have to work at it. And if the brain gets the impression that it has to work at recalling something, then it will not look onto your content favorably. So don't attempt to put more things and more memories into somebody else's brain. Rather, attempt at putting fewer but the right things in somebody else's brain.
Yeah, there's lots of
And
reasons.
thank you.
Yeah, there's proves that point, right? If you ask someone to write down 3 reasons that smoking is bad versus write down 10 reasons, it turns out the people, or some, just ask them to give you 3 reasons versus 10 reasons for anything. They're more convinced they're right when they put down 3 reasons, because they came clearly, they came quickly, and they came confidently to mind. The harder they had to work and the more they had to think about it, it actually had a negative repercussion. So getting your customer to try to remember more may actually be harder and more painful, and therefore they're less convinced because they can't get to the 10th thing. Right about 6 or 7, they start stretching it. So a very important concept here, I think, is not try to necessarily make them remember more, but remember the thing you want them to remember.
Exactly. And if we're preaching that concept of control your 10%, and in order to control it, obviously you have to clarify it and make sure that you repeat it, make sure that it is a distinct one so you're not delivering somebody else's message, then we have to practice those guidelines. We have to practice what we preach when we promise our customers content design. And that is a capability that we're adding onto the portfolio that Corporate Visions has. If we have been in the whiteboarding space for quite some time and that's still alive and good and well, then why not complement it with something where the world lives? We know that the world lives in slideware. And can we apply some of these brain science principles to slides? And the answer is a very loud yes. When you work with us to recreate your content, there are some phases that we complete. We make sure that there is a storyboard that is strong and solid and has all the messaging principles that you have learned from Corporate Visions so far. We also apply a strong visual identity, meaning a strong set of rules that dictate what the presentation is going to look and feel like in terms of color palettes and icons and shapes, of course, taking into consideration existing branding guidelines when we can. And only then we design the slides. But even for here, I want to share some practical guidelines that you can take away right away. And you'll see here some before and after examples. This was a before message around millennials and how they work differently. Sometimes we'll look at these images and we'll say, no more cliched type of photos. Let's apply a visual identity that's a bit more distinguished, something that doesn't look so PowerPointy. Perhaps some content is not necessarily necessary to display on here. And you can see the after version where we apply some real photos, but also some hand illustrations or drawings on top of that. If we had time to show you the rest of the file, you'll see how there's coherence between some of these lines and shapes and even icons on the left-hand side. So that's what indicates to the brain that this is something atypical. It's something that's worthwhile of attention. Unlike this example, since here's another before and after, we are very much anti-iceberg at Corporate Visions plus Memzi, because this metaphor has been so overly used. And here, the presenter wanted to show that as you're doing a combination of these predictive analytics types of skills, there's more under the surface that you have to pay attention to. And you don't always have to abide by that iceberg metaphor to show that there is something under the surface. You can simply show that, yes, indeed, there's a lot of data at the foundation of it all. And on top of that, if you apply the right analytics, then you will do well in your own business. So you can see it's still the same concept, but just visualized differently and in a non-cliche type of way. In fact, if we go back to this iceberg, I'm insisting on this a lot because we've just about had it with the iceberg metaphor. I was pushing our designers to come up with a different metaphor, because the essence of this is that, yes, you can see something And then there's something that you don't see, and perhaps that is worthy of more attention, essentially. So I really enjoy the image that they gave us in return. And as you can see, as you're paying attention to this, would you agree that there is a little bit more authenticity? And with authenticity, by the way, comes emotion. And with emotion, then you're more likely to have memory. I'm monitoring your questions here, by the way, if you have any. And as you're paying attention to the screen, also know that the commitment to content design, as we embed our neuroscience principles, is to move away from trite metaphors. This is a non-example that I'm showing here on the screen, so no more of those types of pictures. I don't think that the space shuttle and astronaut kind of metaphors really do justice to any of your messages. Not your messages, but other people that you know who may be using these kinds of things. These mountaineering metaphors, I'm hoping that they too will disappear slowly from business presentations, definitely from ours. By contrast, if you look at some slides that we help our customers design, notice how now there is a bit of a different approach. Sure, we still use stock photography. At some point we have to, but we're approaching it from a different kind of angle. And one of the things that we're committed to doing for your content is to dramatize some emotions, because the stronger the emotion, the stronger the electrochemical signal in somebody's brain. And as a result, the more likely the memory trace. Even something like this slide that you see here on my screen may start with something familiar, but at some point we provide a twist away from the familiar, jolting the brain from its predictable state. And as we see people present with our slides, we're also noticing not only control over the 10% message, but also an increase in their confidence. Like this person who's using just that slide that I had shared with you is on stage in front of about 200 people, and she has the biggest smile because she knows that her background is now atypical and is giving her audience a lot of joy. We're abiding a lot by this concept of contrast. I know it has been a prevailing message at Corporate Visions for quite a while. Contrast is such a powerful principle for the brain because contrast is a shortcut to thinking. And given the choice of the brain to think or not to think, of course, what do we prefer? So if you reflect on your own messages right now, step back and ask, how much contrast, first of all, do I provide to my audience's brains? And is that contrast noticeable enough? I'm very intrigued by what the Neiman Marcus catalog does. Every so often they come up with these catalogs where in the beginning they will give you some amazing offers that you can pay for. So for instance, if you wanted to have a motorcycle ride with Keanu Reeves, that could definitely be yours for $150,000. And if you wanted to take a balloon ride with some other famous celebrity, that too can be yours for $90,000. And then in the next pages of its catalog, then you might see a robe that costs only $400. And see, by contrast, now I'm thinking this robe is actually quite affordable if the contrast is there. I'm including here on the screen some words that sometimes we use as we design things to jumpstart our contrasting muscles. I'm hoping this will do the same for you, because there's so many opportunities that we have where contrast is concerned. And as we're noticing, especially on the EEG studies that we're doing, is that when the contrast is stronger and it jolts the brain out of its predictable nature, then the emotion is a lot stronger. Here's an ad that we had built a while back for Memsy. Notice how the message is clear, and perhaps as you're looking at the screen, it gives you the joy of getting it. But we didn't just make one rabbit spring away from the other rabbits. That could still be contrast, because now you know you have something that moves and something that doesn't move. You have something that is facing one direction versus something that is facing the other direction. But the moment that we changed its fur to something that gives you a deeper meaning, now you can see how the contrast is bolder. And that is the aspiration that I have for your content, especially the commitment that you will have as you continue working with us, that as we look at your messages and as those messages convert into visuals, we'll make sure that there is some drama in a good kind of way. Tim, what's your reaction to that as you're listening to that message?
Yeah, as you were pointing out, Carmen, when you talked about controlling your 10% before, people who work with corporate visions are familiar with, we force you to identify your value wedge, not the 50 things that you like about what your solution does, but those things that are distinct to you, different from the competition, but important to the customer. And then identifying no more than 3 power positions. And so when you think of controlling your 10%, you hear that in corporate visions. There's no conflict in science here. What you're seeing in content design is a visualization in slideware, if you will, that brings that all to life in an additionally science-backed way. So contrast, we've told you forever that the perception of value lives in contrast. That if you just share one thing and say it's a better thing, it's very hard for people to perceive that if they can't compare that to the thing that's not better. In fact, hopefully it's the thing they're doing today versus the thing you want them to do tomorrow. So the brain, to make a decision, craves contrast. And the part of the brain that's making the decision, the emotional intuitive part of the brain, absolutely craves contrast. And despite what the rational brain tells you, no, I just want an ROI and a TCO, the brain actually requires contrast, and contrast is inherently visual. So the types of things you're seeing here, from the science-backed MEMSI approach to visualization, I think should be super provocative when you think about how do you make your stuff contrast to the competitions when it's out there, but also create the kind of contrast so that the person seeing it can make decisions. And that's what I'm super excited about, is this stuff will contrast you from your competition, as well as bring the contrast needed to motivate and facilitate a decision.
Yes, and our commitment is to make that contrast as bold as possible. The good news is that as we look through a presentation, for instance, and it's sequenced from beginning to end, you don't have to have such sharp and bold contrast at every single turn. 2 or 3 times per sequence is sufficient for the brain to recognize the differentiation and to experience that stronger emotion. And the stronger the emotion, the stronger or the more likely the memory, because the electrochemical signal is a lot stronger. It's one of the segments that keeps us up at night, in the sense of, if we have a solid message that we're starting with, then that converts into visuals. And the bolder the message, the bolder the visual, and therefore the contrast. And there is one last segment here that we're excited to bring you as a result of this partnership. You have been attending skills training opportunities with Corporate Visions for a while. What do we have to contribute with to that portfolio? There are quite a few options that will be coming your way, and all of them are backed by the science principles, and they can range from appealing to your sales force, your marketing teams, your training teams, IT operations, anyone who has a message and they want to earn a spot in somebody else's brain will benefit from all of these workshops. At the premise of the workshop is, of course, the notion of controlling your 10%. And why is that important? Because only then can you aspire at a decision. And one of the reasons why people don't remember and therefore don't decide in your favor is because they don't pay attention to begin with. So these 3 pillars, attention, memory, and decision-making, serve as the foundation of many of the workshops that I'm looking forward to you attending with us. And when you become the master of these 3 pillars, then you can aspire at the brain taking action in your favor. Here on the screen, you can see some of the titles of the most popular workshops, and we're excited to bring these your way very soon. In fact, as you're looking at some of these titles, I'm curious to know which ones resonate with you the most. As we look at the attention, memory, and decision making, here's a practical guideline that I'm excited for you to take away from this section, something that you can apply as early as this afternoon. When we think about the brain paying attention and remembering and deciding, we have to be very humbled by the fact that it will have to expend some cognitive energy. And when the brain expends cognitive energy, it will do so if the reward is big enough. So as you're reflecting on your own content, wonder if that's so for you. Are you offering a reward that's big enough? Because otherwise, if the reward is not strong, then it is possible that your audiences remember, but don't act. And why is that so then? It's because whenever the reward is strong enough, there's a chemical that exists in people's brains. I'm sure every single person here on the call knows about it. It is dopamine. And dopamine is directly correlated to drive, to having enough energy to move. So this is why the reward is so important. This is why we also believe in strong impressions. So for instance, as remote selling, for example, is starting to be a lot more prevalent in many organizations, we're very particular about what happens first in a remote selling situation. So let's just for a moment pretend that you're presenting to one of your customers, and perhaps your presentation is a series of slides, and perhaps you're doing a demo, as you can see here on my screen. Perhaps you have a conversation with your audience. Perhaps you're returning back to slides and then to another demo and so forth. Something in the sequence always happens first. So step back and ask the question, remember, related to priming, is the value strong enough? Because as you're presenting face-to-face, for instance, perhaps the value becomes clear very early on in the sequence. As you're presenting virtually, maybe that's not so, and it should be so. Take something as small as the title of your meeting. For instance, as you go to WebEx, or it doesn't really matter what platform you're using, these days all meeting files and links will have a title. So notice how in this case, this person is calling it a test. That's not motivational enough to announce to the presenter and to the audience that this is a fairly atypical training, something that is worthy of paying attention. In this case, people call it presentation training, still not rewarding enough. But if you're changing that and you're saying something along the lines of use brain science to make them remember you, do you see how you're making the transition from announcing to the brain a topic versus announcing to the brain a reward? The brain does not have time and energy for topics. It has energy for rewards. In a recent study that we were just doing, and we were using the eye tracking devices and generating heat maps for where people are looking. This was a presentation for salespeople. So notice how out of the 4 circles, only 1 circle contains money. So we know that the attention is driven to the reward. So as you're reflecting on your own content, how clear and strong is the reward? Because when you have the answer to that question and you're indeed offering a strong reward, as you can see here on the screen, then you're more likely to get the brain to expend energy in your favor. I'll stop here for a moment. I'll turn it over to Tim to see his reaction as he knows our participants on the call.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about a reward. We should have probably placed it at the beginning of the presentation now, Carmen, as you pointed out, for our best clients who are on this webcast today. But what I would point out here is just so you, as Corporate Vision's clients, you're used to engaging us primarily in similar ways, either doing some messaging development and content creation through a consulting type engagement, or skills training courses, courseware. And what you're seeing is that Memzi brings both similar sorts of services, but totally complementary. Here's a set of skills training courses that, if you look at it, are fundamentally developed to help you design, create, develop better story content, memorable story content and slideware. And Corporate Visions has primarily been negotiation skills, presentation skills, business and financial acumen skills, really for the seller conversation. A lot of these are primarily developed for those in sales enablement and marketing and product marketing, in areas where you are primarily charged with originating the story and the supporting content. So we're excited to see this as a total complement to the sales conversation skills, now to be looking to the story builders, not just the storytellers, but the story builders, and give you same science-backed skills development for you and the work you do to build the content that drives the campaigns and the presentation. So we're excited to round out the skills training portfolio at Corporate Visions and bring to your organizations another set of skills that would, you know, by the looks of most companies, I know Carmen was generous and said, not yours, of course, but other companies, presentation decks, there's a lot of opportunity here is the way to look at it. So back to you, Carmen.
A lot of opportunity, especially as you're looking at these four things in combination, is what puts you in a position to create and deliver memorable content, which has been our reward for you all along, because we're hoping as favorite customers, you'll continue to create memory traces in other people's brains so that you can solve this problem that you can see here on the screen, and you'll avoid the situation where your own customers may have this reaction displayed here. Overall, what we're noticing from all the studies that we're doing and from all the content that we create and from the skills training sessions that we deliver is that unfortunately business people are more forgettable than they are memorable. And this is why, as we focus on these very concrete things that you see here on my screen, you will be able to rescue that and create memory traces in others' minds so that they can react in your favor. Before we conclude, we have a few minutes. If there are some questions that you have as you've been listening to us all along. Somebody here is asking if we can apply this to writing an article, and Nellie, the strong answer and simple answer is luckily yes. You can apply any of these items that you see here on the screen in a written format, in a video format, in a presentation format, because even in an article, for example, if we start from the neuroscience research principle, every single paragraph that you write has the potential to impact how the next paragraph is being read and whether it is read. And every single article should have not three main themes, but only one main theme. And the more clear that theme is, and the more repeated it is throughout, and the more distinguished it is from other articles, the more you'll convince other people to read what you have to write again. And any article will be memorable to the extent that at some point, at least once or twice, has a very strong contrast in it. And people wouldn't even continue reading it unless the reward was really strong, and especially if it was made strong from the very beginning.
Hey, Carmen, could you pull up the offer slide while you're taking some questions? While we still have the folks here at the top of the hour, here's the deal. You're current customers, and we want to do something special for you. And you see this link here, and it's case sensitive. It'll take you to a landing page. Here's the offer we're making to Corporate Visions customers only. Offer number one, you get to pick one of the two, is to have one of your whiteboards, one of the messages that we built for you and the whiteboard deliverable converted into a memsified deck. I mean, that's a new verb for us here, is memsified. And we're going to memsify it. And the idea being recognizing that many of those presentations with that story and that visual are going to happen in environments where people can't draw, aren't drawing, and to be honest, will refuse to draw. And we want to give you an opportunity to convert one of your whiteboard stories into the additional option of a MEMSI-driven deck. The second option is going to be maybe you have an existing deck that you think is important to the organization, but is just not cutting it based on everything you heard Carmen talk about today. You could choose that option, and we want to give you a special offer, a one-time offer to rehab one of your company's most important decks. And so what we're going to do is we have we're going to slice the price in half from what it would normally cost to do this with MEMSI as an exclusive offer to you. And so you go to the landing page link here, you pick the one that you're most interested in, and then you're going to hear from your representative from Corporate Visions to talk about how to make this happen. The goal to get this deal is to sign up for it by the end of the year. So maybe there's maybe there's a few end of the year dollars sitting around and you're like, what can I get for this much anymore? Well, you could get a MEMSI deck and convert your whiteboard or rehab a deck. So take a look at that. We think it's a wonderful opportunity to make a difference quickly in your organization with this kind of science behind it, recognizing the business, the language of business is typically slideware, and we're here now to serve you in a science-packed way. So that's the offer as you consider it, and we appreciate everybody being here today. Carmen, any last wrap-up comments from you or questions you want to take with the 3 minutes that we have left?
It's fun to approach any kind of corporate content challenge that you have from a brain science perspective. And when we understand how the brain processes information and how it remembers it more often not, and how it makes decision most often not, then we develop this neuroscience humility of things that we can do differently and some new habits that we have to develop for ourselves in order to meet the demands of the modern brain, which even though the brain has not changed much in the past 40,000 years, what we know has changed is our option in movement and our threshold for stimulation. These days, the modern brain needs a lot more to stay focused in terms of stimulation. This is why as the world is moving more towards remote presentations, very much like we are doing right now, we know that something has to be done differently. And this is what we're here to bring. Just as for those of you who are on the call and have been paying attention, we're very grateful for your focus. Take a quick guess. How many slides have we used for this time that we have had with you? You can use the questions box to send us your estimate. I'm curious to know what you're estimating. And if we were to take your average, we would probably not match what you're suggesting. There's one person who is getting close. Darren said 100, and we were very close to that. We had 92 slides for today's session, and this is what we meant when we said earlier that we want to practice what we preach, to appeal to the modern brain, because if we understand it, then we're more likely to build memories, and if we're building memories, we're more likely to earn decision making. Tim, back to you.
All right, it is the top of the hour. Thank you so much. We're so excited for the MEMSI Corporate Visions partnership, and MEMSI is now part of the Corporate Visions family. So this service, those skills training are exclusively part of the Corporate Visions offering, and we look forward to giving our clients first dibs, first opportunity to make the most of this. We thank you for your belief in the science-backed approach of Corporate Visions. And now that we're bringing the slideware portion of it to you, we're confident that you'll be equally as excited about the science you're going to find here. So thanks, Dr. Carmen Simon. We appreciate it. And thank you, Corporate Visions friends and family. And we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.